Behind all of your favorite songs and albums are countless demos that rarely see the light of day. And if you're anything like me, you probably have hundreds and hundreds of these unfinished project files just sitting around on your computer collecting dust. Well, every now and then I actually sift through these project files one by one and find any hidden gems my younger self might have left behind. And sometimes my younger self comes in clutch. This is the story of how I flipped this forgotten melody I wrote 8 years ago into my newest song, Only One. Let's go. Real quick, make sure you're following me on Twitch. I live stream music production and songwriting, as well as DJ sets and other fun stuff. I actually made Only One pretty much entirely on stream, so go check it out at twitch.tv/Megaphonix, link in the description. So, in summer 2016, I just released what are still some of my biggest songs to this day, Open Your Mind and Don't Stop. People really liked both of these tracks, and at the time, I thought the style would kind of become my secret sauce. So I spent the next year or so iterating on these tracks to come up with more material, and one of those projects was Don't Stop-ish.
Someone cooked here.
A few months later, I turned this melody into a more comprehensive progression on piano, which brings us to this project file from 2017. Now, this is one of those melodies that just stuck with me over the years. Anytime I would sit and play around on the keyboard, I would somehow arrive at this melody and be able to recall it perfectly. Eventually, I decided to just go full steam ahead and turn it into a complete track, which brings us to... When I started streaming on Twitch, I used it as an opportunity to be more open with my creative process, pouring through old ideas that no one else besides me had ever heard before, and making brand new music start to finish alongside the chat. Okay, so my plan with this video was to edit down like 12 hours of my Twitch streams, but if we're being perfectly honest, I'm a music producer, I'm not a video editor. So instead, I'm just going to walk you through the finished project file and show you how it all came together. All right, so here we are in the project file for Only One in FL Studio. First thing you'll notice is how I arranged the playlist contents. All the automation goes on top and everything else below that, just to make it easier to bounce out stems later. We're going to be going through 8 categories: drums, leads, bass, chords, effects, ARP, and vocals. Let's start with the drums. I actually like to start off by layering it up pretty substantially so the idea can start to take shape quickly. You can hear throughout the track how the various layers contribute to the energy and pacing, making the first drop feel solid and impactful, while the last drop feels complete and final. A big part of this is the various hi-hats and shakers I'm using. So we start here with a basic shaker. And the second drop introduces an open hi-hat, which gives it a little more groove. And the last drop has all the loops and sounds together for maximum effect. Another thing that's really subtle but does make a difference are these high tinkling sounds. They just add that extra sparkle that gives life to the mix and keeps it from feeling too flat. Then there's these percussion, ear candy kind of bits, and my goal with percussion is to find the right register or frequency spectrum for these rhythmic elements to sit in without competing with the rest of the instruments. This could change depending on the song and instrumentation, but in this case, I'm using a clicky sort of mid-range transient loop and spicing up the beat with occasional record scratch sound effects and choked crash cymbals. Another interesting thing I incorporated in the drums was this filtered amen break going into the drops. Honestly, I didn't know if this would work at first, but the more I tweaked it, the more it started to sit right. Sometimes it really is just a matter of experimenting and dialing it in. All right, now on to the leads. Similar thing with the drums here, it's a matter of segmenting and building up the track over time. I started with full-on layering and worked my way backwards, stripping out certain layers at certain times to keep the melody interesting. I also duplicated some of the patterns and threw it down or up an octave for more variety. Here are all the layers separately. And you'll notice this little counter melody harmony here as well. And then down here, we've got this vocal chop layer, which basically just gives more dimension, shape, and personality to the otherwise pretty bland synths. So for lead effects, I actually kept the beginning of the first drop completely dry. This makes it punchier and more in your face, while the reverb and delay that come later give it more space once the chords come in and add that atmosphere. We've also got this reverb and delay throw that adds a little transitional element to the repeated melody patterns. Again, trying to keep the song interesting and engaging with the sense of movement. Now let's talk bass. It's surprisingly simple in this project. I have a sub bass that I use for the intro and bridge, and everything else is just a simple saw pluck. This was actually one of the hardest parts to get right in this track. I didn't want to have separate sub and mid and high layers for the drops, but I also wanted the bass to be noticeable in the mix, and ultimately I settled on this slight lift in the treble frequencies to pronounce the attack a bit more, and then I worked on the sidechain. So I don't always do this, but I have a separate sidechain channel here for bass versus everything else. I did this because kick and bass meshing is absolutely critical for getting the right groove and clarity in the mix and master. If this isn't just right, it can cause serious problems when you're trying to maximize loudness and fix other mix issues. This isn't sponsored, but I highly recommend checking out this new plugin by EDM producer and developer The Him. It's called Sub Ninja. It's designed for exactly this problem, and honestly, I wish I had it making this track. It would have made my life a lot easier. Chords. These are a big part of how this track came together. The first idea I showed in the beginning of this video was just a lead and a bass, but adding these plucked chord synths really added depth and harmony and gave it more developmental runway. Also, it works with the bass to create a sort of chugging rhythm section vibe during the breaks. You'll also see the filter on these chords moves around a lot throughout. Filters can be used to perfectly control the energy level of an instrument or track, and this is something I learned from Daft Punk. If you listen to Digital Love, the entire emotional journey of that song is really just around various filters on a static 2-bar loop. I absolutely love it. It's incredible what you can do with filter automation, so definitely recommend using that a fair amount. And again, it all comes back to energy and intrigue. Aside from these main chords, there's the break chords, which are pretty self-explanatory, and this sort of tension string, which is a great way to add more finality to final drops on the top. A ton of my favorite artists use this technique. You'll hear it in S.G. Lewis, Charlie Puth, and I absolutely love using it too. All right, moving on to sound effects. These are something that I honestly think I hyperfixate on in music way too much, whether it's mine or someone else's. My approach to sound effects here is subtle but effective. You rarely want it to be noticeable or steal the show, but you do want listeners to feel how it pushes and pulls the energy. I'm admittedly a bit of a maximalist when it comes to this, but some of the best songs in history have no sound effects, so sometimes less is more. Here you can see I have risers, white noise impacts, and my favorite reverse cymbal of all time. I literally use this in like every single project. So there's this arpeggiated 303 synth that gives a bit of edge to the track. I introduced it in the second build-up, and again, just slowly intensifying it throughout. And ARPs are a great way to add rhythmic and sonic variety. Without it, the track wouldn't have nearly the same personality, and you can do a lot of really cool stuff with it. For example, in the third build-up here, I kind of go crazy with it, increasing the panning and gating to give a really cool effect heading into the last drop. I actually did a similar effect in my track Stay from 2022, and I did a video about that song as well, so make sure you go check that out. All right, finally we get to vocals. Oh my God, I went through like 30 splice vocals before I decided on this one. I've tried recording my own voice before, but I'm not really at the point where I'm comfortable with that yet, so maybe next time. But once I found this vocal loop, here's the original, by the way.
Tell me I'm the only one, yeah.
So I went in and I made a few chops and automated some effects like delay, reverb, formant shifting, just to shape it into something that sort of fit the character of the song. And going back to my tracks, Open Your Mind and Don't Stop, in those I really wanted the vocals to be catchy but not overly repetitive. It's a fine line, but I had that in mind here as well. Another key part of the vocals are these subtle vocoded chords. They give the vocal more body and top line energy. I just routed a basic polyphonic saw with some slight detune into vocodecs, and I went from there. It's basically backing vocals done quickly and easily, just using the same source vocal loop. You'll also notice these little ad-lib chops. They're washed in reverb and EQ'd to sound like they're in the distance. These help to fill the space without being wall-to-wall vocals, and I even experimented with having more vocals on the drops, but ultimately stripped it back and let the vocal chop lead from earlier take the stage. And And lastly, as for mixing and mastering this song, I wouldn't say I'm a mastering engineer, but almost all of my musical releases over the past decade have been self-mastered, including plenty of commercially licensed tracks, so maybe my insight could help, I don't know. So my mastering chain is these two plugins, Maximus and Invisible Limiter, sort of. So on this song, I bounced the instrumental and vocals out separately and brought them into a new project so I could try some new techniques to maximize loudness and retain clarity without noticeable distortion. The first thing I did was I threw Sooth 2 on both to eliminate the harsh frequencies that would sort of resonate and build up in the master, and I put track spacer on the instrumental, sidechained it to the vocal, and dialed it in on that last drop so the vocal wouldn't overcompete with the instrumental. Basically, what this is doing is it's taking the vocal and ducking those same frequencies in the instrumental in real time. It's subtle, but man, without it, there's just like way too much going on at the end there. Other than that, my advice would be to reference other tracks you like for balance on the frequency spectrum and dynamics. Also, make sure you test your music on as many different sound sources as you have available. Even phone speakers will help, and do so at a variety of levels. Sometimes quiet mixing actually gives you the best insight into how your track will be perceived by casual listeners. Think about what it would sound like if your song was played as background music in a Target or a department store. That's how you achieve as close to a perfect mix as possible. So there you have it. Hopefully this inspires you to go revive that old project file sitting in your folder, or push on and finish that melody that you're stuck with. Let me know down in the comments if you learned any new tricks from this video, and if you enjoyed it, give it a like down below and subscribe for more music content. Peace.